Okay, everyone. Well, welcome everyone to this latest ODI lunchtime event. It's great to see a good number here today, and I know we've got at least as many watching online via our ODI live stream. We're absolutely delighted to be hosting Tim Harford today, who'll be talking on the topic of development as trial and error, drawing on his new book, Adapt. For those of you that don't know Tim, he's a senior columnist in the FT. Those few that don't know of Tim, I should say. He's a senior columnist for the FT, a million-selling author who presents on TV and radio. He also claims on his website to be the only economist in the world to run an agony aunt column, or maybe an agony uncle column, Dear Economist, in which he answers readers' personal problems with a light-hearted use of the latest in economic theory. And I think this kind of sums up something about Tim, for me anyway, that he's that rare individual that's able to combine the ability to make economics fun and interesting and enjoyable with serious journalism. And he's won awards from the Royal Statistical Society and Mensa to prove it. He's also a visiting fellow at Oxford University and Cass Business School, and not so long ago worked at Shell and the World Bank, so he is one of us.
Is that Shell or the World Bank?
I think one of the really interesting things, and one of the reasons why this is such a relevant topic for us, is adaptation's an issue that all of us working in international development are struggling with, whether we're researchers or policymakers or practitioners. And I think one of the big challenges we face is adaptation at multiple scales. I just did a search on the ODI website this morning on adaptation. And just within this institute alone, there are people looking at adaptation of pastoralists to changing climate patterns in the Horn of Africa. There's people looking at the international aid architecture and how it needs to adapt in the face of results. There are people looking at the global food price crisis and how we might need to change the setup for global food and the food infrastructure. And if all of that wasn't enough, we've got this perpetual surprise engine that is globalization that just seems to be constantly putting us on the back foot, constantly shocking us into new ways, creating new fractures in the financial system, pushing up energy prices, pushing political change. And I think every international agency was caught off guard by the Arab Spring. So I think questions of adaptation, who adapts, where they adapt, how they adapt, may well underlie some of the most defining challenges we face in development. So I'm really glad to have Tim here to talk about some of the things that he's learnt about and some of the things in this book. Before I hand over, I'm just going to say a little bit about how the session will work. Tim's going to talk for about 40 minutes, I think 45 minutes, on development as problem in a problem.
Don't worry. Ignore that. Success begins with failure.
Development is trial and error. There you go. And then we'll be handing over to Dr. Randolph Kent. For those of you who don't know Randolph, he's the director of the Humanitarian Futures Programme at King's College London, who've probably been looking at issues of adaptation in international aid agencies for longer than anyone else in the sector. So he'll be sharing about 5 minutes of reflections on exactly what this issue of adaptation and innovation means for us if we're working within international agencies. Then I'll open up the floor for questions and comments. We've got people watching online who'll also be sharing questions and comments via our online team. And I'll try and basically wrap things up by about 2:30. And Tim's very kindly agreed to sign copies of his book over on the far side of plug. And so that will happen at 2:30 for those of you that are interested. So without any further ado, over to Tim.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. Thanks everyone for coming. Actually, Ben, I had a quick question. I think people will see better if I stand up and grab this microphone, but will that cause a problem for people watching online? No?
Malcolm?
No, that'll be fine. Okay, so I'll do the evangelist preacher thing. I've always wanted to do that. So I'm sorry for the last minute insertion of some slides. I really just wanted to show you pictures of a toaster. Now, the toaster is very important. This toaster was made as part of Thomas Thwaites' toaster project. So Thomas Thwaites is a design student, well, probably formerly a design student. I think he's graduated now. But a couple of years ago, he set himself the task of making a toaster from scratch. So the vision I need you to have in your heads at this moment is design student, loincloth, Swiss Army knife, nothing else. Can you make a toaster? So the first thing Thwaites did was to buy this toaster, which costs £3.99 from Argos, So it's it's around about an hour's work at the minimum wage. It's not a lot of effort. Does it take to get hold of this toaster? And you could admire here its sleeky efficiency, the plastic coating. So this was the model for Thomas Thwaites' toaster. Remember, 1 hour's labour will get you this toaster. So the first thing he did was to take apart the Argos toaster to see how it works. It turns out the Argos toaster has over 400 components and subcomponents. So this is more than one component per penny. It's quite impressive. So that's challenging. It also has a number of different materials. So there's copper, there's iron, there's mica, which is a sort of slate-like material that the heating element goes around, nickel, there's plastic. The plastic's very important. It doesn't look very nice without the plastic. There's also the electrocution to consider. It's a big deal. So lots of materials. Where would Thomas Thwaites start? He said, okay, I'll start with iron. Britain, of course, is a post-industrial society, so that we don't have any iron mines left. So Thwaites called up a museum that used to be an iron mine and said, I'm a design student, I want to make a toaster. And then he went down, and it turns out they'd misheard him on the phone. They thought he'd said he was making a poster. But pretty soon, the confusion was sorted out, and Thomas Thwaites had a suitcase full of iron ore. And then, of course, you have to turn the iron ore into iron, which... Anybody know how to do that? Yeah, neither do I. So this is the first effort to make the iron. So this, I realise that it may be a little dim. This is basically a large dustbin. It's got barbecue coals in the bottom, and this is a leaf blower punched through the dustbin wall to blow air over the coals to try to get them really, really hot. This didn't work. Then Thwaites was rescued because he discovered there's a recent patent out for producing iron from iron ore in a microwave. This is the second microwave. Now, but you're already thinking, what about the vision, Thomas? What about the original vision, the Swiss Army knife? A microwave is a more expensive and more complicated object than the toaster you're trying to create using the microwave. But he said, look, Tim, I realised that if it's just you naked in a forest, you could spend your whole life trying to make the toaster, and you're never going to get there. He made many compromises. But the plastic, he originally tried. Well, where does plastic come from? Oil. Where does oil come from? BP. They've got loads of it. Spill it everywhere. So he called BP and he said, I've got a jug. I'd like to go to an oil rig. I need to make some plastic. And they said, no. I don't know why. Extraordinary. They said no. In the end, first he tried to make plastic from potato starch. The trouble is, that kind of plastic is edible. So he lost half of it to mold and the other half to hungry snails. And eventually he just got some plastic from a dump and sort of melted it. And I guess it's recycling, but it doesn't feel like he's living up to the original vision. Nickel he got by buying a Canadian commemorative coin made entirely of nickel. There were many, many compromises he had to make. Here are a number of the items he had to use, a couple of microwaves. There's the leaf blower, the trash can, the wood, the toast. It would be wrong to say that Thwaites entirely succeeded in his quest to make a toaster. Let me try and describe the object he made. You remember when you were young, you might have asked your mother to make you birthday cake in the shape of a particular object. So for me, it's a chocolate fort with those Cadbury's chocolate fingers around. But different people might ask for different things. Now imagine you had asked your mother to make you a birthday cake in the shape of a toaster. And imagine that your mother was incredibly drunk. You might get something that looked a little bit like this, which is Thomas Thwaites' toaster. And he said, look, Tim, it warms bread. It warms bread when I plug it into a car battery, but I'm not sure what will happen when I plug it into the mains. He did eventually summon up the courage to do so, and 2 seconds later, the toaster was toast. Now, the reason I tell the story, this is sort of an economist creation myth, the complexity and the sophistication of the objects, all around us every day. The toaster you could get on the market for an hour's work, but you could spend a whole lifetime trying to make it yourself and you'd never get it. And this would normally be the moment to sort of cue a Milton Friedman-esque sort of eulogy to how amazing the market is, and look, sort of it's a decentralized team effort. Look at all these people who are involved. So this guy works in a copper mine, the Chiquimata copper mine in Chile. It is a guy, but it's not a 3-year-old. It's a really big truck. So, and he drives this truck loaded with copper ore around the spirals of this mine all day, and he doesn't know whether the copper is going to go into a toaster or whether it's going to go into telecoms wires in China or whether it's going to make the casing of a bullet. He doesn't know. He doesn't need to know. It's this incredible decentralized team effort, and it's marvelous and wonderful and brilliant. Now, 5 years ago, I would just have given that a thumbs up and said, well, isn't the market amazing? We don't really understand how it works, but it produces these great things. Now I'm not so sure. And the reason is I see problems. There are problems in the world. We've climate change, we've the financial crisis. I think there's a good case that there's an innovation slowdown. And of course, we have the development problem. We have a lot of very poor people living in countries where the average level of income is also very, very low. So we have problems, and simply to say the market's terribly complicated and sophisticated doesn't get us very far if we want to solve problems. So to solve problems, you need to interfere in that market system. You need to mess with the market system. You need to make changes. You need to make improvements. And so the toaster, rather than being a symbol of the incredible sort of sophistication of the market, well, it is that, but it's also a sophistication of the obstacles that lie in wait for anybody who wants to improve the market situation. Anybody who wants to solve any problems in this incredibly complex society, incredibly complex economy that we've created. You don't need to look at the screen anymore. I'm not going to show you any more slides. I just wanted to show you my pictures of a toaster. So how do problems get solved when it's so complicated? I mean, I could talk for ages about expert failures. I'm not going to. Let me just make a statement. When the economy is actually, I lied. I'm going to show you one more slide, okay? The number of products in the economy. So in a primitive hunter-gatherer society, about 300 products. These estimates come from Eric Beinhocker at McKinsey Global Institute. So, you know, there are 2 types of flint axe, 2 types of loincloth, 2 types of hut. I mean, these are the societies in which our brains evolved. 300 products. Anybody want to guess how many products there are served by Starbucks? 300? Okay, let's take a vote. Votes for fewer than 300 at Starbucks? Okay, a couple of votes, 3 votes. Votes for more than 300 at Starbucks? Okay, so we think it's more than 300. Okay, you're right. Okay, somebody shout out another number.
10,000.
10,000. 10,000. Votes for more than, votes for fewer than 10,000. Fewer than 10,000 in Starbucks. Votes for more than 10,000.
637.
10,000 was closer. It's actually 85,000 served by distinct products. Well, now you see, and they're kind of cheating because every time they introduce a new kind of glop, they can multiply the number of products. Okay, it's multiplicative. They've got different sizes. They've got different sort of fat contents in the milk. They've got different syrups. 85,000. So let's go for Walmart. So Walmart, they can't multiply the number of products available by adding syrupy glop. So how many in Walmart? In Walmart, 100,000. Okay, so that seems a bit more reasonable than that Starbucks number. So 100,000 products available in a typical Walmart. How many products available in, say, New York or London? How many distinct types of product? So that if you set up a cash register and you wanted to put a barcode on every single product and service, how many different barcodes would you need to distinguish them all? Anybody want to guess? We've got 5 million over here. 100 million? In the billions? Okay. Yeah, well, we reckon about as many services as there are products. So we reckon adding services doubles the number, and I'm including... But given that we have orders of magnitude differences on different... So these guys think there are 1,000 times fewer than those guys. It turns out those guys are right. It's about 10 billion. And we don't really know, but that's a reasonable estimate. 10 billion distinct types of product and service. And remember, many of them are actually more complicated even than the toaster. So it's a tremendously complex system. So I am not going to show any more slides. I'm just going to come out and say, this is a system that's too complex for experts to plan their way through first time. You cannot solve any problem in this kind of system from your desk. It doesn't matter how smart you are. So how do problems get solved? Well, we could look at one problem-solving mechanism that's proved pretty effective. So we know the market has proved quite effective at solving problems. Not every problem by any means, but it's solved the material affluence in the Western world problem pretty well. So without saying markets are brilliant and markets should be used in all circumstances, you know, the problem the US Army suffered in Iraq was that they should have privatized it and broken it up. You know, without coming out and saying that, is there something we can learn from the way markets work that tells us something about how problems are solved? And I think the answer is yes. So I talk to business people about how the market solves problems, and they say, well, it's very simple, Tim. I'm extremely smart, and all the people I work with are extremely smart, and that's how we solve all these problems. I'm not so convinced that this is actually true. So for me, the classic example of which really tells us how markets actually work is a Tom Peters and Robert Waterman book, published almost 30 years ago, called In Search of Excellence. It's one of the best-selling management books of all time. And what Peters and Waterman did, Peters went on to become this sort of baseball cap-wearing, larger-than-life management guru. What they did was to select, partly through judgment, partly by consulting their colleagues at McKinsey, partly through empirical work, through database work, they selected 43 different companies that they regarded as America's most excellent businesses. And they wrote a book about how these excellent businesses actually conducted themselves. And of course, this is the template for basically every management book that's ever been written, really. You know, Microsoft do this, do that, like what Microsoft do, because they're making a lot of money at the moment. There's a lot of management books like this. So they wrote In Search of Excellence, and they described the research and development policy and the finance policy and the ethical standards and the governance and the recruitment and the sales and marketing and everything, the organizational structure, the culture, everything about how these companies worked, so that you too could read the book and you could be excellent just like those excellent companies. 3 years later, Business Week published a cover story, and the cover story simply read, "Oops, who's excellent now?" Because nearly 1/3 of those 43 companies were in severe financial trouble. And Peters and Waterman had picked companies like Atari and Wang and Pan Am. And, you know, the early 1980s turned out not to be that good for some of these companies. Now, I would love to say this is a story about, you know, how silly management gurus are and how silly Tom Peters is, but that's not fair on Tom Peters. I think it's really a story about failure rates in the market. The market is a trial and error system. And it's not just Tom Peters. I could give you chapter and verse. I could show you lots and lots of evidence collected by the economist Paul Ormerod, collected by the business historian Leslie Hanna, lots of evidence about very, very high failure rates in the economy. I mean, I guess in a nutshell, 2 pieces of information, 3 pieces of information. I'm going Monty Python, 3 pieces of information. So number 1, about 10% of American businesses go bankrupt every year. Okay? So 10% every year. That's your background failure rate. It varies from industry to industry, from sector to sector, from year to year, and from place to place. It varies a lot, actually. But 10% is your base failure rate. Okay? And 10% a year obviously means over 5 years, probably about 40% failure rate. It's a pretty high failure rate. Okay, fact number 2 is that you can study the patterns of those failure rates, and they match incredibly well the extinction of biological species. So you have very, very big extinction events where lots of firms die out, where lots of species die out, and you have small extinction events where basically hardly anybody disappears, species or firm. Now, who cares? Well, possibly nobody should care, but one interesting indication, if you think about how species evolve, they do so completely blindly. There's no foresight in evolution. You know, species don't decide to evolve this way or to evolve that way. No, they just all die out one day or not. And that's how evolution works, and it's an incredibly powerful process for producing very complex, well-adapted things. Now, Paul Ormerod, brilliant economist, wrote a wonderful book called Why Most Things Fail, has studied these patterns in biology and basically said, well, the economy seems to be the same. And that suggests, it doesn't prove, but it suggests in a number of ways that chief executives aren't really worth what we pay them because it's all random. It's all trial and error. We don't know. It's an amazing problem-solving device, the market, but it's a problem-solving device. It's nothing to do with incentives. Let's exaggerate for a bit. It's nothing to do with incentives. It's nothing to do with a profit motive. It's all to do with trial and error. It's all to do with the fact that just a lot of these companies are constantly going bankrupt, and there's no particular sign in the system that anybody's able to see the future or make forecasts or anticipate future trends. It's just some of them happen to do things that later turn out to look incredibly smart, and they end up growing really big. Franchises, they buy out their competitors, they get copied. So those good ideas spread, and a lot of people who make missteps and don't anticipate future trends and don't do things very well, it may be entirely random, and they go out of business. And then we don't need to worry about them unless they're Lehman Brothers, in which case we do. But there's a whole chapter in the book about that. So it's about trial and error. It's all about trial and error. This is an incredibly powerful problem-solving system. And it's interesting to reflect on the scientific method, which is a very different system for getting rid of bad ideas and producing good ideas. But like biological evolution and like economic evolution, it's also a really effective, not perfect, but really effective trial and error mechanism. We've got lots and lots of different ideas. Many of them will fail. We're fairly confident of identifying the ones that are failing and getting rid of them and spreading the ones that are succeeding. And that's the scientific method. So the book is really all about this trial and error process in many, many, many different contexts. Now, what's the sort of lesson for development? Well, to give you a lesson for development, I just want to very briefly give you a potted history of a dead Soviet engineer called Peter Palczynski. And to give you Peter Palczynski's biography in one phrase, he's the engineer who told Joseph Stalin he was wrong. So you can imagine what happened to him. And I talk about Palczynski in the book. It's a fascinating guy, compulsively honest, write letters. Dear wife, having a great time in Western Europe, learning all about Western engineering, having an affair, hope you don't mind, love Peter. Or he wrote a letter to the Prime Minister of the Soviet Union saying, dear Prime Minister, I hope you understand that communism's all very well, but science is more important. Just sort of unsolicited letter. His friends managed to persuade him not to send it. And he's just sort of compulsively honest guy. But the way Palczynski lived his life, the principles he espoused when he was criticizing these giant Soviet engineering projects, actually just a nice little manual for effective trial and error. So 3 bullet points. Number 1, try lots and lots of things. Yeah, because 10% of them are going to fail, right? 10% every year will fail. So try a lot of things. So that's variation. We get variation in biological evolution. We get variation in a well-functioning market. We get variation in science. Number 2, make sure that the failures are not going to kill you. So make sure that Lehman Brothers is not interconnected to every other bank in the system. Make sure that the thing that fails, isn't the reactor cooling system in a nuclear power station. Make sure the failures are survivable. And often Palczynski's criticisms of Stalin-esque engineering projects were all about saying, well, if this goes wrong, then it's just this gigantic thing, but we could do it bit by bit, we could do it smaller. So lots of things, make sure the failures are survivable. These are basically evolutionary biology principles. Now, the third principle is what really interests me in terms of development, and it's make sure you can distinguish between what's working and what's not. Make sure you can distinguish success and failure. It sounds really obvious. Turns out to be incredibly difficult. There are many, many reasons why it's difficult. I write in the book about the psychology of success and failure, about cognitive dissonance and denial and loss chasing and all the silly things we do to deny the fact that we failed, or to recover from a failure, or to cushion ourselves from the pain of having failed. It's also an organizational problem. Organizations really struggle with learning what is working and what is not. And again, in the book, I discuss the tragedy in Iraq, where the US Army is a hierarchical organization, is failing, and from the top is utterly unable to acknowledge that failure and to respond to it. And change in the end comes from the middle managers, it comes from the colonels and the majors, a tremendous risk to their own careers. They're the people who say, well, look, actually, this isn't working, we need to try something new. So there are many organizational reasons why it's hard to know what's working and what's not. Now, clearly, this whole trial and error message fails if you cannot tell the difference between what's working and what's not. There's no point trying 1,000 things. There's no point if the failures are survivable, if ultimately you cannot tell the difference between what's working and what's not. And this, I think, is a real challenge for development organizations, for aid organizations. It's a challenge for every organization, but it's a particularly profound challenge for us in this field. My friend Owen Barder, who I'm sure some of you will follow, who's now at the Centre for Global Development, talks about a problem with feedback loops. So if you go into a coffee shop and you don't like the coffee, you don't buy the coffee there again. The feedback loop's pretty tight. If you're in a well-functioning Western democracy, there's a pothole outside your house, you want the pothole fixed, you phone the local council and so on, the feedback loop is not as tight, it's not as effective, but it's probably still there. You probably, if you really care, you probably will get the pothole fixed. The feedback loop in aid, in terms of the voice of the people receiving the aid, is very long, very loose, very prone to break. And let me give you a couple of examples. One where the feedback loop worked and one where the feedback loop, well, arguably worked, but it took a long time. So one is the discovery of microfinance in Bangladesh. Oh, yes, it's very important. I'm treading on the wires. So many of you will have read Muhammad Yunus's autobiography. So Yunus is faced with this terrible situation in Bangladesh. There are people coming down from the north and suffering from a famine and literally dying in the doorsteps in Dhaka. And Yunus is saying to himself, I've got to do something about this. This is the worst of all possible ways to die. What am I going to do? So he realizes, well, there are underutilized resources. There are fields that are not used in the winter season, which is dry. So what I need to do is somehow get those fields used. So what's the missing element? Well, the missing element is fuel and engines, because you can pump up water from the aquifers and you could irrigate. Okay, so why aren't farmers doing that? Well, it turns out the missing element is really credit. They haven't got access to credit. So then he gets together with some local farmers and he says, I'll lend you money and we'll do a profit sharing agreement. So I'll fund the fuel, you can do this irrigation system, you'll get a second harvest, and then you split the harvest with me, with the landowners, the tenant farmers, split it 3 ways. Now, in terms of agriculture, this was a complete success. In terms of sustainably financed aid projects, it was a total failure. And the reason is the farmers decided there was absolutely no reason to pay back this academic from Chittagong University, and they didn't. So Yunus lost several months' income, which is quite a big deal for a young academic. Now, Yunus, in the book, writes about the worm's eye view. He says, you have the bird's eye view, aid agencies have the bird's eye view, they see everything but just not very well and from a long way off. But the worm's eye view, you're right up there and you see the problem. So you just bump into something and you change direction. And Yunus described what basically seemed to be exactly the same idea, which was extend finance to people who have very, very high, potentially very high returns if only they had access to capital. And he just tweaked the idea and adapted it to local circumstances and lent money to women who were doing textile projects and making wicker chairs and baskets in rural Bangladesh. And they turned out to be extremely good repayers. So because Yunus was there on the ground, he was a local, he understood how things worked, he was providing his own money, he could adapt. A second example of this feedback loop, this is, well, in the end, I guess it's inspiring, is play pumps. Anybody here know about play pumps? No? So when I was at the World Bank, I wrote about play pumps on this World Bank blog, because it's a tremendously exciting idea. So access to water, a big deal. Using hand pumps, a big faff. Why not take away the hand pump and instead power the pump by linking it up to a child's merry-go-round? And the children will play on the merry-go-round, they'll go round and round and round, and they will pump water, and the water will go up into a large tank. The tank will have advertising on it, that'll pay for everything. And when the women of the village come along, instead of having to work with this hand pump to pump water, they can just open a tap and take water from the tank. And it's safe and it pays for itself, self-funding. It's just a brilliant idea. And there was this wonderful photograph out there of smiling, happy children playing on a merry-go-round. And so I wrote this blog post for the World Bank and put the photo of the happy children. I said, this is cool, isn't it? And it wasn't the only one. So, international rap stars started getting involved. Laura Bush started getting involved. She's not an international rap star, by the way. She's the wife of the former president of the United States of America, just to be clear. The World Bank was in there, funding, and it was all great. And then this guy called Owen Scott, who is a Canadian engineer, volunteers with Engineers Without Borders in Malawi, starts posting videos on YouTube. So some of them are interviews with teachers in Malawi saying, please stop taking away our hand pumps and replacing them with these merry-go-rounds. Owen Scott also publishes this great video of him. There's a hand pump and there's a play pump. And he pumps a bucket of water with a hand pump, and it takes 20 seconds. And then they go on to time him pumping a bucket of water with the play pump. And he basically just runs round and round and round, looking like a lunatic, exhausting himself for 3 minutes. It's humiliating, it's demeaning, just going round and round and round, and eventually he fills up this pump. It turns out the play pumps don't work that well, especially since you need to get the water right up into this tank. It turns out in Johannesburg, townships in Johannesburg, there were lots of people to see the advertisements and lots of children to play on the play pumps, and so they probably worked very well. But in rural Malawi, there aren't enough people to see adverts, and they don't have any money, so nobody wants to pay for adverts, so the project is not self-funding. And there aren't actually that many children in a rural village. So the merry-go-round is actually not getting played on that much. So if you sneak into a village in Malawi, what you see is the local women, in a very demeaning way, and it's very inconvenient, and it takes time, just slowly plodding around, pushing this merry-go-round around. Of course, if you turn up with a camera to take a photograph for the aid agency, all the children see the white guy with the camera. They all jump on the merry-go-round. And then you take this photo of the smiling children on the merry-go-round and you send it to the World Bank, and some blogger who has no idea what's actually going on the ground posts it on his blog and says play pumps are great. The feedback loop. By the way, this has, thanks partly to Owen Scott, I am told this is being fixed, and they're looking at maybe only installing play pumps in very high population density areas. This issue of figuring out what is working on the ground is really, really important, and it's a really tough problem. Now, how do we address it? A number of ways. So one way is to take a lesson from medicine, because medics are a bunch of people who have spent a long time trying to solve problems in complex systems they barely understand. Now, just a sort of story about the medical, progress in medicine. So I was born in 1973. I know it's hard to believe I look so young, and I'm nearly 40. But I was born in 1973, and I nearly didn't make it. Well, I exaggerate, actually. I think I was fine. But the reason I say I nearly didn't make it is because my parents put me to sleep in my cot face down, which turns out to be about 3 times or 4 times more dangerous for a child than being put to sleep face up. So, it's not very dangerous either way. Most children don't die. Fortunately, in the Western world, most children survive infancy. But cot death still does kill quite a few children, and being put face down turns out not to be the way to do it. So why did my parents put me face down? Were they psychopaths? No. They had read Baby and Childcare, the Bible written by Benjamin Spock. Not the guy with the ears, the other guy. And he had an incredibly popular book, and it wasn't just Spock. The received wisdom among paediatricians of the day was children may vomit during the night, and therefore they should be face down because they just vomit onto their sheets rather than sort of vomiting into their own mouths. And this is probably a way to prevent cot deaths. Turns out not. And eventually the evidence was gathered, and then after a while the evidence was not only gathered but assembled by the Cochrane Collaboration, which is a bunch of doctors working together to put together high-quality evidence. And then eventually it wasn't just gathered and then sort of assembled and analysed, but actually they told people about it. And then finally, parents were being told to put their children to rest on their back. And a recent sort of epidemiological paper said it doesn't take that long. There are probably only about 60,000 babies killed by the delay in gathering the evidence and telling parents about it. So, it's one of these randomized trial things. It's no big deal. They only solve small problems. So, actually, I say randomized trials, but it's worth, if you look at the epidemiological paper, that particular research was not a randomized trial. It was actually hundreds of really small, non-robust trials, 8 babies, 12 babies, observational studies. And the amazing thing about the Cochrane Collaboration was they're able to put together hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of small studies and eventually say, actually, none of these studies tell us anything, but all of them give us a really robust finding. So I'm a big fan of randomized trials in development. I'm going to talk too much about randomized trials in development because you've all heard it. And they're great, they don't work everywhere. But it's not just about randomized trials, it's all about all sorts of gathering together and analyzing evidence in a rigorous way. It can really, really make a difference. I will talk briefly about Archie Cochrane, who's this amazing Scottish epidemiologist who revolutionized the way that doctors think about medicine. So Cochrane was the guy who, after he died, they set up the Cochrane Collaboration in his name, in his honor, and Cochrane Collaboration discovered this thing about cot deaths. So Cochrane was this big promulgator of randomized trials and all kinds of evidence-based decision-making in medicine. And the reason I think it's worth mentioning Cochrane is what he really railed against. I tell you this only out of interest because I know there's none of this in the development industry. But just out of interest, Cochrane identified something he called the God complex. Now, a God complex is where you get somebody who has a lot of authority, possibly written popular books, a bit of a media star, or maybe just somebody with a lot of funding power in a powerful organization. And this person knows what the answer is, and we don't need to do the research, okay, because God already knows. So Cochrane used to sort of try and puncture his colleagues with their God complexes all the time. And that, as I say, doesn't happen in development, so only in medicine. So in one case, he did a randomized trial. They tried to close it down. He managed to open it up in a different city. He did a randomized trial on recovering from cardiac surgery. Do you recover at home or do you recover in the hospital? And all his colleagues who worked in cardiac wards in the hospital said, it's unethical to do this trial. Cochrane gathered them together after a while and said, okay, well, we've got the provisional results and it looks like you were right. Recovering at home is actually more dangerous. The death rate's higher. So there was a lot of thumping of the table by all these guys who said, look, we always knew that this was a crazy idea. We always knew your trial was unethical. You must stop it at once. And Cochrane said, oh, that's interesting, because I just swapped the two columns over in the tables before I presented them to you. Turns out it's actually your cardiac wards that seem to be killing people. I mean, it's not statistically significant yet, but obviously you'd like to stop the trial right now. We don't need to wait for the results, do we? It would be unethical to continue. The tumbleweed rolled across the table. So he really campaigned against the God complex. Another thing I write about in the book, and I'll be very brief because I know I want to hand over, is organizational structures that adapt on the ground. Because clearly, good decision making that recognizes that something is going wrong on the ground and responds to problems, it doesn't necessarily need to be data-based. It doesn't necessarily need to be based on randomized trials. It's also about just people who can just see there's a problem. And decentralization, I think, often works very, very well. I talk about decentralization efforts in the US Army in Iraq. I talk about decentralizations in Timpson, the UK high street key cutting chain. I talk about decentralization in Google, in Whole Foods markets. Whistleblowers in finance, whistleblowers in industrial safety. So I compare Deepwater Horizon, 3 Mile Island, and Lehman Brothers. And the message from all of them is that people who knew there were problems, who didn't feel able to speak up and to say, look, we have a problem here, we need to change what's happening. This is very important. But I will say, and I'm going to say this more when I speak to the civil servants at the Institute for Government tonight, you can't just decentralize and forget about it. You clearly got to get the incentives right on the ground. It's very, very important. In the US Army, the incentives were pretty clear. People were dying. Civilians, and as far as the US Army officers were concerned, they were particularly concerned about their own men. They were getting killed by a failing strategy. And they didn't care if they were passed over for promotion repeatedly, because they were. They didn't care if they were denied reinforcements. They didn't care if they were sort of disciplined by their superior officers. They just wanted to save the lives of their own men. Very, very brave decision makers. The middle managers of the US Army basically saying, it's got to change. The way we're running things has to change. The incentives there are pretty sharp. Writing about Whole Foods and Timpson, at Google as well, they're actually extremely hard-headed about the incentives of the people on the ground. So they decentralize and they say, yeah, in a Timpson store, you've got the decision-making power to respond to customer complaints. You've got the decision. If a kid comes in, he's got £7.83 and he wants an engraving for his grandmother, you've got the power to decide whether he gets it or not, because there's no £7.83 engraving on the price list. You have to decide whether to give him that deal or not. But Tim said every week there's a profit-related performance bonus, and it's based on the performance of that particular shop. Many organisations, I think this is interesting, it's not just the US Army, many organisations use peer monitoring. They basically say, well, we in the centre can't really watch what you're doing, but your peers can watch what you're doing, and if we get the incentives right, peer monitoring can be a tremendously effective way of sort of spotting what's working and what's not. I mean, this is, I'm going to stop speaking in 30 seconds, well, maybe 45 seconds. It's such a big topic, but just to recap, trial and error is incredibly important. We cannot get things right first time. Many of the projects that we honestly believe are going to work will not work. They will fail. And for many reasons, we will tend to deny that failure. We deny it psychologically, and organizations will deny it. And we need to be incredibly honest with ourselves about recognizing when things have gone wrong and fixing them. Now, I've been talking to government officials a lot recently, and they keep telling me it's just too hard to do this. You can't do government by trial and error. You can't do randomized trials. And so I've decided I'm going to tell them about Archie Cochrane. So Archie Cochrane, this amazing Scottish epidemiologist, World War II, he was in a prisoner of war camp. He spoke fluent German, and so he was, and he's a doctor, so he's the camp doctor. He's in charge of the prisoners. The situation is incredibly tense. German soldiers are just shooting into the camp for fun. At one stage, one of them throws a grenade into the toilet block because he hears suspicious laughter. And Archie Cochrane's one of the guys who has to go in and clear up the mess. So the situation is appalling. And Cochrane is dying. And many of the men he's looking after are also dying. And Cochrane doesn't really know what's killing them. It's incredibly uncomfortable, debilitating, swelling up, pitting edema. He doesn't really know what's causing it. So he decides he's going to run a randomized trial. He has already smuggled in vitamin C. He then manages to buy on the black market supplies of Marmite, which contain vitamin B12. And then in the hospital, the ward of the camp, he runs this randomized trial. He gives B12 to half the prisoners and vitamin C to the other half. And then after a few days, it becomes pretty clear that it's the B12 that's doing the trick. And he goes to speak to the camp guards. And you imagine basically the sort of dishevelled Billy Connolly, this huge ginger beard and long hair, and this Scottish doctor ranting at them in German, in a Scottish accent. This is the land of Goethe and Schiller, and this is completely unacceptable. And he shows them the results. He shows them the graph. And then he puts it down, and he goes back to his room, and he collapses and weeps because he's sure it's hopeless. And one German doctor picks up the results, and he says, this evidence is incontrovertible. If we don't deliver the supplies of vitamins to these prisoners tomorrow, we're committing a war crime. And the next day, the vitamins arrive. So he understood it's not just about figuring out what works and what doesn't. It's also about making the rhetorical case. Really good evidence about what's working has an incredible rhetorical power. And when I'm speaking to these civil servants and they tell me it's just too difficult to collect the evidence and it's just too difficult to run the trial, I tell them, well, if Archie Cochrane could do it, so can you. Thank you very much.
Wow. Well, Tim, I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone here. I thoroughly enjoyed that. That was fantastic. And I think a few themes that are really worth teasing out as well, aside from the potential for a Marmite advertising campaign, which I think you really should be contacting them about.
Tell the Danes.
I think there's something around the trial and error and this kind of mechanism of trial and error. Does it work in development? Is it broken in development? Where does it work? How well does it work? I think there's something around that for me. The what works piece is obvious and connected to that, the feedback loops. But I think also around organisational culture. Who are the Archie Cochranes in the development sector at the moment? Are we giving them the support that we need to? I suspect not. But those are some of the themes that kind of stood out for me. Randolph, I wonder if you can give us some thoughts.